Thanks, Mike. And I'm getting a bit older, as Mike implied there, so I've got to have a few notes and things with me.
Got your glasses?
And hopefully I don't need them. I've got big text. Okay. This particular subject, which should be up on the screen, hang on, there we go, is one which I sort of stumbled into. And today we're just going to look at some of the history that led up to an event which took place about 100 years ago. 100 years ago. And in many ways, the presentation I'm about to show you is a work in progress, and it will probably end up as an article in AR or OTN. And I would appreciate any comments later on or about information. If you feel that there should be some corrections made, I'd be keen to hear from you. And if you feel that you've got some additional information, I would like to hear that. And also I would like to acknowledge Jim Gordon, whom Mike spoke about before, he's well known to you all here, for his encouragement to further pursue this article, or this particular subject, just over a year or so ago. So, some here today aware that our magazine, OTN, back in 1989, not 1899, 1989, contained a story about an air race which took place in 1929 in Australia. Today's presentation, and you can read that if you go back to, I think it was February 1989 OTN. But today's presentation covers some of the same ground, but also looks at aspects of the event from other perspectives. And it also includes some new information and some recently rediscovered photographs. Besides being an acknowledgement of early wireless experimenters and aviators and the techniques they employed, this presentation is also a glimpse at a period leading up to what became a very active amateur radio group in our organisation, and that is the RAAF Wireless Reserve. And perhaps I should also add that aeronautical wireless was used during World War I, so well before the 1920s, but it was largely limited to spark transmissions from the aircraft to the ground, and they were fairly well dispersed because it was very difficult to send the Morse down to ground. You obviously had to have an operator with you in the plane. You couldn't very well fly the plane and send the Morse at the same time, although some could. But this communications was used for helping to correct the ground artillery activity. In other words, the aiming of the guns on the ground. Were they hitting the targets or not? If the aircraft had to receive a reply from the ground, it was usually made by laying strips of canvas in patterns on the ground, and they were simple diagrams which meant something to the pilot. For example, land immediately, or cease that survey, go to number 2, and so the man knew what to do up in the plane. Okay, that's all background. I hope you enjoy the journey we're about to make. It seemed to me to be somewhat pessimistic to talk of difficulties, but pointing out the difficulties involved in aircraft radio is really the first step in the commencement of their elimination. So obvious. That was spoken by one Bill Grono, VK3RV, in February 1930, and it was reported in an aeronautical magazine. In later life, Bill became president of this august organisation, the RAOTC, and we'll have a bit more about Bill a bit further on. From its very first days, amateur radio had a link between it and aviation. And this was via George Taylor, the man who convened the first meeting of like-minded wireless experimenters in 1910, from which the WIA grew. Taylor himself was an early aviator, and in fact, he was secretary to the Aerial League of Australia, which was established in 1909. It was, in fact, a sort of WIA of early flying. The ALA also issued the very first recognised flying licences in Australia, and the first one went to William Hart, who was a dentist in Sydney, and he had to complete a number of courses in a figure-of-8 shape, and they were in the order of 3 miles in length, and the total, actually they were actually 5 kilometres in distance, and there were 8 circuits he had to complete at a height of 50 metres or more altitude. It was a French licence, and I'll just pass this around. Can you grab that, Craig? You might like to look at that. There's some photographs on the back and a copy of the certificate, and you'll note on the certificate that Taylor was the man who signed it. That is in fact a copy of the first flying licence in Australia. So, many wireless magazines, even in the late 1920s and early 30s, featured articles about flying. And this included the first and later issues of Amateur Radio magazine, which from October 33 featured the RAAF Wireless Reserve logo, which is, I don't think I can get my point there. And that was 2 years ahead of when the logo was formally adopted. And that's another story. Some background, and I don't expect you to read all this, but this is what led to that key event in 1929, Australia's first major air race. You can see there 1909 was the establishment of the Aerial League. The first amateurs in Sydney to unite came together. That became the WIA. Down here a bit further, the Air Navigation Act of Parliament was proclaimed in 1920. It wasn't effectively put in operation until 1921 when the Civil Aviation Board became operational. Essendon Airport, 1922, which probably more correctly the Essendon Airfield, opened for business. And also that was a year that amateur licensing post-World War I came into operation. And a couple of interesting stats there. I can't read it from here, but 1927 there were 45 Commonwealth aerodromes, 12 licensed private aerodromes, 2 private fields, 91 emergency landing grounds within Australia. That was basically what we had. No wireless. So, to that background, the field of aviation started to get really going. The number of trained pilots, importation of large quantities of aircraft following World War I. It sounds like somebody starting up an engine for a plane outside there. Caused the Australian government to make provision for civil aviation. And as I said, the Air Navigation Act was proclaimed in 1920 and came into force in March 21. And it resulted in the Civil Aviation Board being established. Now, remote communities in Australia benefited greatly from developments in civil aviation here, and perhaps the earliest and most notable advance was, in fact, the Reverend John Flynn's mantle of safety, which employed aviation and wireless. Flynn's aim was to crush the Australian tyranny of distance for medical cases. as suitable, inexpensive HF radio equipment was not available commercially, Flynn set about to develop some himself, and he did this with a lot of help from Harry Cowper, VK3RV, and Alf Traeger, VK5AX, together with others. During 1925, they were ready for the initial field testing, and amateurs were asked to assist with signal reports. The pedal generator came a little bit later. And I understand, although I haven't been able to confirm it, that Flynn was actually made an honorary member of the WIA South Australian Division, and he was treated as an amateur, although he never did take out a licence. In 1926, with the help of the H.V. Mackay Trust, that's H.V. Mackay of Sunshine Harvester, the Australian Inland Mission of the Presbyterian Church proceeded with a one-year trial of a basic flying doctor service. So they only had limited funds and they decided to try it anyway. But then, strangely, a partnership developed between the Australian Inland Mission and the fledgling Qantas. And that allowed the flying doctor service to commence in earnest, flying out of Cloncurry in Queensland from May 1928. And this was the world's first aerial medical organisation. I'm still really giving you a bit of background here to how all this came together. And I'll just depart for a second and move into 1938. A tragic commercial airline crash occurred when the Kohima, an Australian national airline, DC-2, ploughed into the western side of Mount Dandenong. Heavy fog caused the plane's navigator to miscalculate and make the assumption in the plane that they were actually flying over the township of Daylesford in central Victoria. The town, in fact, was Sunbury. Disaster was but a few minutes away. All on board killed. And here is a single frame out of a newsreel item, and you can hardly see anything because of the fog and smoke, but you may be able to pick out just a bit of the body of the plane and part of the wing. This unfortunate event really accelerated the formation of the Department of Civil Aviation. Aviation wireless communications facilities became available in Mascot in 1932 and Essendon in 1935. And not all planes were suitably fitted with radios for some time. But let's get back to our story now. So that's the scenario that existed, and we'll now just return to 1929. A limited wireless system was implemented during 1929 at Essendon Airport by the Aero section of the WIA. Who? Do I hear you ask? Who? Thank you. The Aero section of the WIA. And it involved a number of very interesting and notable amateurs of the day. It's people who make things happen. Both Howard Love, VK3BM in 1929, later VK3KU, and Bill Grono, VK3WG, were key players in the life and growth of Australian amateur radio at that time. And here you can see Love was in fact a World War I AIF pilot, and he, of course, started Kingsley Radio. His name was Howard Kingsley Love. Bill Grono, VK3WG, built a lot of equipment for the Institute, and he owned and operated Zephyr Products. But first I want to look at another person, Ross Hull, A3JU. And here we have some extracts from magazines which were edited by Hull, one on 9 metres and another on 5 metres. We had 5 metres here in Australia before we had 6 metres. During the early 20s, Hull and Love were involved in planning the Trans-Pacific tests, and in 1924 organising the first WIA federal or national convention to bring all states together. Ross also encouraged amateurs to experiment with higher and higher frequencies, and as early 1925 published articles on 9 metres and 5 metres in Radio Broadcast magazine. Ross was an excellent organiser, communicator, technical writer and editor, so much so that the ALL grabbed him when he made a visit to Hartford. And as you all know, he continued on there for a while, came back to Australia and then went back to Hartford and worked as editing the ARRO handbook and various other things for them. This particular magazine commenced life as Experimental Radio and Broadcast News in August 1924, changing its name to Radio Broadcast in March 1925. And initially it was a Victorian Division publication. In August 1925, Radio Broadcast became the official organ of the WIA. Howard Love was a competent amateur, a leader, and was awarded the first honorary life membership of the WIA, in those days the Victorian Division, for his Trans-Pacific Communications work. He was also a federal or national president between 1928 and 31 inclusive, and retained a great interest in flying, and of course he had the interest in wireless. And this particular airborne wireless broadcast experiment, that's Howard Love there with a transmitter on his lap. This particular experiment also involved Ross Hull and Bruce Masters, VK3RV, who was the Victorian Divisional Secretary at the time. They intended to broadcast from a plane circling over Melbourne to a wireless exhibition down below, and it was also rebroadcast over 3LO, now 774 for some unknown reason. While serving as a fighter pilot in the 4th Australian Flying Corps during World War I, Howard was shot down behind German lines and imprisoned in the Karlsruhe POW camp. That's 1918. And it was possibly during that time in the camp that Howard realised that amateurs could provide a group of trained civilian wireless operators for any of the services in a future emergency. Later on, when he got back to Australia and became involved in radio, he became involved with the WIA, and this matter was discussed at the 4th Federal Convention held in Adelaide in 1927. Then in May 1929, the Minister for Defence, Sir William Glasgow, publicly sought amateurs with shortwave facilities to assist the RAAF. They had problems. 1929 also saw the Air Board suddenly approve the establishment of a wireless reserve just in time for the International Air Race, which we're about to talk about. But initially, for the first 12 or so months, it might have been nearly 2 years, the wireless reserve was controlled entirely by the WIA. And we're heading into a bit of a story about the air race. And this radiogram form is quite interesting. You can possibly read there, or some of you can, that it's the Western Australian division of the WIA. There's the coat of arms. They've called it a radiogram. And here we have an insignia which is supposedly that of the Royal Australian Air Force Wireless Reserve. Interesting, because that was the final emblem for the Wireless Reserve. By 1933, the Wireless Reserve became fully managed by the RAAF under Commanding Officer Bob Cunningham, VK3ML, and Flying Officer Vaughan Marshall, VK3 UK. And it was also formally then known as the Wireless Section of the RAAF Reserve. And Bob Cunningham, of course, went on to help establish this organisation in 1975. I think Vaughan Marshall was in there as well. Bill Grono, he was very much a doer. Bill was a WIA Federal President for 6 years. His Zephyr products, particularly the microphones, were well known widely and used widely. And this microphone here, the ribbon mic, I think was sort of a bit of a rip-off of the 44BX, I think, the RCA job. Not quite the same shape, but I know that certain parts interchange. Earlier, during the 1920s, Bill became interested in aero communications and built and installed a number of aircraft radios. He investigated and apparently largely solved the multiple noise interference problems in light aircraft by suspending receivers on bands of rubber to minimise valve microphonics, and also bonding all of the metal items in the plane together and back to the engine, and as well as that, adding screening and shielding to some of the radio equipment. So, as you were all keen to know more about the WIA Aero section, let me help you. This booklet was prepared for a 1930 wireless exhibition. Has anybody here seen that before? No, it's extremely rare, and I only know of one copy, and we hold it in the archive, in the Institute archive. But apparently it was for sale at the wireless exhibition, and it certainly helps clarify the aero section. This is part of one of the pages in the book, and you can see that the Institute was divided into 3 sections at that time, the aero section being one. It, in reality, worked apparently as a subsection of the key section, which of course for Morse operators. In May 29, Bill Grono was elected as president of the aero section. And here we have another page out of the booklet with a few bits underlined, but basically what they're saying is that the main aim of the Institute's aero section was to help develop aircraft wireless for civil aviators to enable reliable communications between the air and ground. And if there is a typo there, and how that ever got through some wireless people, I don't know, but it certainly wasn't VK3WU, it was VK3WU. So, a station was established during 1929 by the Institute in conjunction with the Aero Club at Essendon Airport, initially for communications with the Aero Club planes. The Aero Club later became known as the Royal Victorian Aero Club, and I think it still exists in Moorabbin. And this is the first known Essendon Airport-based wireless transmitter. Licensed as VK3WU to the Aero section, it was built by Bill. A few years later, it was reconfigured as VK3WI Junior and used in the WIA meeting rooms at the War Court Chambers in Melbourne, which is where they had their office and meeting rooms. And as a matter of interest, this will give you a chuckle, the aerial used in the city was a full-wave ZEP, strung between a 40-foot pole on the Law Court Chambers roof and a lattice mast on the AWA building 4 buildings away. Try doing that today. The transmitter could work on all bands between 3.5 and 28 megs apparently. Yes, I think this was at the time when not all of the city had electrically operated trains in the main streets. And just a closer look at the transmitter. The power supply, everything homemade. The transmitter, hang on, I'll just come down here because I think this is the one. Yeah, the transmitter was link coupled from the exciter here. You can see this is the actual link, the twisted pair running up to the grid circuit for the PA. Bank of filter capacitors up top, and it even had its own circuit diagram. Sorry about that. You should never walk in front of speakers with microphones switched on. So it even had its own circuit diagram up top, which that's about as the best I could get out of the picture. It was a very small part of the image. But strangely enough, you could still work out what some of the bottles were and what they were doing. Okay, and moving on, we got closer to the racing event, and suddenly Big Brother VK3RV, a 250 watt transmitter, was brought to Essendon. This was around the 21st of September, I'm pretty sure of that date, which was just a week before the East-West air race was due to start. Perhaps somebody had an inkling that bad weather was likely and felt that a few more watts might help in poor conditions. And this photograph shows a group of the guys that actually moved the transmitter with the transformer obviously handled separately. And there are a couple of people there that I just want to point out. Doug Whitburn, VK5BY, and Watty Watkins, 7DX. They just happened to be in Melbourne at the time that the transmitter was being relocated, and they played a big part in the air race, which we were about to venture into. But just before I do, sorry, can I just pass that one to you and pass that one around? A few people will be interested to see that. Sorry.
That's all right.
Craig. This is an aerial. This is an aerial view, and Craig will pass this picture around to everybody else later on. You'll be able to see a bit more detail. It's a much later picture. It's the earliest one I could get down at the Historical Society at Essendon at the Aero Museum, which incidentally is well worth going to if you've not been there. The Aero Club's building was this one here, and you can just make out not this tall bit there, but that is the top of their control tower, which was built onto the roof of part of the Aero Club. This is the Old Buller Road, which went right through Essendon Airport. The main runway at Essendon now is right through that up to here somewhere. What else can I point out to you? Melbourne skyline, you might just be able to make out a little bit up there. Melbourne, yeah, so that was the airport in 1940. And here's another, I'll get myself sorted here. Here's another view of that part of the airport around about 1949. And there's the front of the Aero Club and its original control tower. This was the new tower that Civil Aviation built, and of course these other buildings further buildings have popped up, and quite a bit of activity there. In fact, the photograph's interesting in that I recently discovered that at that particular time the Aero Club's building was in the process of being converted to Melbourne's International Terminal building. So we've come a long way. Back to the amateur equipment. A discarded aircraft shipping crate was converted into a radio shack by the group setting up VK3WI at Essendon, and the transmitter was originally installed here at the WIA's Ashburton Experimental Station, and it was used for early shortwave experiments, I believe between 25 and 26. Now, this is very interesting in as much that later on this was sold off. It's not the Ashburton area, it's a different part of Ashburton to where the current WIA BIC is at the moment. But, and in fact, just down the road was a transmitting site for 3DB. So it was and I think there was another station out there too. So that's where this station was established. Later on it was sold off and an extension made to it and was converted into a house, and I've got a copy of an ad. It's not a very good photograph, but a copy of an ad for this property, and it does mention that it was once a wireless station. Moving on, and here we've got a closer view of the 3WI transmitter. We don't know a lot of detail about it, only what's up there. It was in fact a 250 watt unit. This was, I think, an 80 watt 40 metre final and 40 metre driver, and exciters and two rectifiers. I think they were probably run not in parallel but used one on standby in case the other failed. And a view inside the shack at the airport, and the two operators that are mentioned there, which are a bit hard to read. So 3PT and 3ER are the two guys in the shack, and that's 3ER and 3PT. And what else can I tell you here? No, that's probably about it there. We'll move on to that one. There's a closer view of the gear, and these things are actually ever-ready BIOS batteries. A bit hard to see, but if you imagine your battery's on edge, and this is like a tar filler that they used to put over the individual cells on some of those things. That's probably about as much as we can see on that one. And then this is a magazine photograph which shows a better general view, including a better view of the receiving setup. If we just go back one, two, you can just see the edge of the receiver there, whereas this other photo is a slightly wider angle. It was obviously taken on a different day, because if you look up there, there's only one BIOS battery sitting up on the shelf, and I think there's some sort of document there. I would suggest that somebody said, "Where in the hell's your licence certificate?" So somebody's rushed away and got a picture frame and put the thing up. But the photo was obviously taken a day or so after the earlier photos. Again, this was from the Slipstream magazine, the commercial magazine about flying, and it really does amply demonstrate that 3WI was in fact the station concerned there. Now, we're just about at the end, but the East-West Air Race was originally scheduled for the 28th of September to the 4th of October in 1929, but there's a bit of confusion about the actual starting date, and that was because of the bad weather. And if you try to read reports in newspapers and magazines, A, there are not many of them, and B, they've got the dates all over the place, everywhere between the 28th and 30th of September. And I suspect that that is because of what happened at the end of the race. The end of the race was to help celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of White Man in Perth. And they actually had a special event a day later after the planes arrived in Perth. So I think that's how the later date got involved there. In Western Australia, it was known as the West Australian Centenary Air Race. The race started in Sydney and finished in Perth. It was a projected distance of some 2,450 miles, or 3,942 kilometres. It was to be the longest air race in the history of aviation. But those Europeans, they unfortunately eclipsed it by a race around part of Europe, a stage race around part of Europe, just not long before this was held. So they shouldn't have told everybody that this was going to be the longest air race in the world, blah, 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 because it backfired. Originally there were 27 entries, only 17 started. The contest was to run over 6 days in 12 stages, so they'd fly in the morning to an intermediate point and then on to the night point. The total prize money was about $200,000 or £2,000. The weather conditions were atrocious almost everywhere, and the radio propagation was a bit tricky. Much was being learnt by all. The RAAF made 5 Wapitis available to the wireless reserve to help manage the race, but only one had a radio. After leaving Essendon, communications were lost when the heavy weather caused the trailing aerial out of the plane to wrap itself around the tail of the communications plane, VMZAD, the Wapiti. To make matters worse, the RAF decided they were going to run on their allocation on 23 metres. Now, the other bands that were being used were 80 and 40. So there was a bit of a problem there because skip got in the way. About halfway between Adelaide and Melbourne is Nil, and this humble storage shed on the airfield played an important part in the race. The shed was selected as the station site by local amateur Herb Brown, VK3RV. Does anybody, somebody here mention VHF activities earlier on? Where is he? Mike, can you remember Herb 3NN on 2 metres AM? You are a newcomer to 2 metres, aren't you?
His son, 3NN, who's a Ballarat.
Yeah, okay.
Has also come up on 2 metres sideband, but he's not really with us these days.
No, okay. Well, Herb used to call himself Nancy Nan, and I can well remember hearing him on 2 metres AM, VK3, Nancy Nan. Yeah, from, where was he, Yannick or something?
Yannick.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Okay, others involved were Alan Hutchings, VK3HL from Kallawatta. Some of you may have worked Kallawatta in the Alara contest recently. There was a station operating there for a short period. And Ivan Hodder, VK3RH from Glenorchy, also near Storr. Hodder was a very keen amateur, went on to be an important civil aviation employee and was an office bearer within the Big Div of the Institute. 3 separate receivers were in operation, and this is the only photograph I've been able to find from the listener end. And this was at the Nil setup. And the listener end also reported in October that, quote, remembering that courtesy demanded that ladies are first, our first contact from the Nil station, VK3RH, was made with VK3HM, Mrs. E.L. Hutchings, this lady. And she was Alan's mum of Kallawatta. She helped Alan get his original licence, and then she decided to get a licence herself. And just quoting the article report, just finished up with saying, and we were naturally pleased to learn that our signals were getting out well. Elizabeth is the first known YL operator in Victoria, and Marjorie, his sister, became licensed in 1932. Okay, 2 stations remote from Sydney and Melbourne helped save the day, especially in those first sections from Sydney to Adelaide. Skip was a major problem with the transmissions from the RAF plane, as I mentioned, but everybody was on a steep learning curve. The reserve or guard, wireless reserve or guard stations, VK7BX and VK5BY, whom I mentioned earlier, Being further away from the plains than both Melbourne and Nil at the particular times of day concerned meant that they could hear the plains more clearly than the stations in Melbourne in particular. And both 7DX and 5BY contributed greatly, and greatly is underlined to the final success of the event. 5BY in particular helped planes reach Adelaide's Caulfield airfield safely in extremely poor weather conditions. The story goes, and I've seen a photograph of him with a set of headphones on. One set of headphones was tuned into 40 metres, one was tuned into 23 metres, and he had a telephone, and he was relaying weather conditions to the planes. It was apparently full on. There were people landed in Adelaide with severe facial injuries. They got thrown around all over the place. It was, really an event. The race pushed on. On the third day it was Adelaide to Ceduna, about 565 kilometres. They aimed for a distance of around about 600 kilometres a day. Then into Western Australia, where the name changed and the control stations became VK6VK, 1E Vincent of Kalgoorlie, and VK6NO in Turnbull of Subiaco. That's as much as we know about them at the moment. All control stations were part of the wireless reserve. The fourth day, Ceduna to Forest, fifth day, Forest to Kalgoorlie, sixth day, Kalgoorlie to Perth via Tamman. The total race distance ended up by being 2,400 miles or 4,000 kilometres, and some minor changes were made to reduce path lengths over water in South Australia due to the bad weather conditions. The bad conditions resulted in the race being a real test for pilots and their mechanics. Of the 17 starters, 14 finished. Some actually crashed, but no lives lost. Prizes went to, the first prize was a handicap, £1,000 to Horry Miller in the DH9. Second prize, $28,000, £300 to Major Herwood de Havilland, flying a Gypsy Moth, and he was also the only competitor to fly solo on the whole course. And the third prize went to A.T. Cunningham, don't know anything about him. Fastest time over the complete course was Herwood de Havilland, who averaged 105 miles an hour. We can almost drive at that speed, at distance these days. Not quite. So ended the great East-West air race and the first major activity of the wireless reserve. There was little doubt that the Air Board considered the involvement of the Amateur Wireless Reserve a great success. About a month later, now before I say that, this is from 7DX's log. He kept a log of his activities. Unfortunately, it's not a complete log of the air race. I suspect that was in some other document. But this is a message he received from the Air Board. And I've just quoted a couple of bits out of it here, that the Air Board wished to congratulate the Amateur Wireless Reserve on their efficient and loyal cooperation during the East-West air race. It sounds like the Air Board was running it. They weren't. There is no doubt that this rapid means of communication enabled much closer touch to be kept with the situation, and that the Amateur Wireless Reserve stations proved their exceptional value as a chain of communication in emergency. That's the punchline. And they also went on to say that the Melbourne, Nil, Adelaide and Perth stations particularly had given exceptional service. In reality, when it all boils down to tin tacks, I put it this way, that H.K. Love had finally convinced the authorities that it was worthwhile using amateurs as an emergency form of communications. The wireless reserve continued in a modified fashion until the mid-1950s, when after the war, and it then just sort of faded out. I think there were a matter of differences of opinions. In conclusion, there are more stories to be told about the early aviation involvement by amateurs in aviation, including the 1930 Mackay aerial expedition to Central Australia, in which love was involved. And of course, there must be a lot of stories about the Wireless Reserve, a very interesting and valuable organisation, especially when World War II was declared. And we have included a few of those sort of reports in Wireless Men and Women at War book. If anybody hasn't seen that and they've got a bit of an interest in this field, that's worth getting hold of. There are still a few copies at Bayswater. And it covers a number of the fellows that I've mentioned in this presentation today, but in more detail about some of their wartime activities. So, unless we have any questions, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Sorry it's gone on a bit longer than we anticipated.
Outstanding talk. I mean, Peter's research is exceptional, isn't it? It really is. I mean, I don't know how much time that took, Peter. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. It's surprisingly interesting. £2,000 was an immense amount of money in those days. It still is, to my way. Is there any knowledge as to how that prize money was funded?
I can't tell you directly how it was funded. I do know that there was, I only found this out very recently, there was an air race committee and it was established in Collins Street, Melbourne, so there's another, it was in an office in Collins Street. It was mainly controlled by a RAF pilot. I've just lost his name, but he was the man that was flying VMZAD, the one that had the aerial problems, a well-known pilot. Oh, wait on, actually. Hang on, just wait for a second. I have his name here. No, it's not on. I brought a few things with me that I can let you know. Who was behind it, I don't know, but somehow I'm still mystified as to how the thing started off as being an east-west air race and the Western Australians. Is that video camera still running? I better be careful what I say. Those Western Australians, greeting to anybody in Western Australia. Why it suddenly changed name when it crossed the border. Now, we know from documentation that its purpose then was to publicise the 100th anniversary. But whether Western Australia may have put money into it, the government may have, I don't know. Really don't know. But there were, on the list of people who were involved with the management of it, there were some notable persons. Yeah, gives you something.
Any more questions?
Good, I've got away with that.
Thank you, Mr. Wolfenden.